Well, good evening. It's about 7:05, so I think we'll get things started now. I want to take a moment. First, thank you all for coming out tonight. We've got a number of resources here to help. We're going to do a bit of a presentation first, and then we're going to let folks come up to the mic and ask questions. I am going to ask for basic ground rules that we get one question at a time. If there are multiple questions from somebody, looks like we'll have enough time for folks to come up a second time if there are additional questions as we do that. But the goal is, one, to make sure everybody gets to ask their question and that they can, and everybody else gets to hear what that question is along with the answer. We have here tonight at the far end, Sands Cleary, who is our Director of Health. Jim Olson is from Ty & Bond, our licensed environmental professional. Brian Carey is both Conservation Director and currently Interim Public Works Manager. We're here to address some very serious concerns, and as most of you kept up on recent events, there's some significant issues that we're dealing with respect to a violation of public trust, and we've all been let down on that. And I want to make it clear that no one can contaminate our town. There's material that was put on our ball fields and parks that never should have been placed there. We're moving as quickly as we can. We've identified 20 sites that we are testing, and we'll identify any remediation that needs to be done there. The remediation will be done under the guidance of Ty & Bond, along in consultation with the Department of Health and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We're committed to making our parks and fields safe for everyone. We also are working with Parks and Rec that has closed, I think, 9 or 10 of the affected fields. We'll also be working with the Board of Ed on the fields that are impacted in the school district. It's my understanding the Board of Ed is also doing some additional testing, and I believe the superintendent got those letters out to the parents involved. So with that as a kickoff, we've got 4 live, I guess counting myself, panelists tonight, and we have one audiovisual person. We have somebody from the, Meg Harvey from the State Department of Health, was with us last night, is not able to make it tonight, but with the courtesy of Fair TV, we were able to get a video clip of her both in her presentation and her answer to some questions. So we're going to kick things off with Sands Cleary, but also give you a chance to hear Meg Harvey's comments after we're all done presenting.
Good evening. As Mike said, I'm Sands Cleary. I'm the director of the Fairfield Health Department. I've been asked to give a summary of sort of where we are with this recent issue. Mike's going to go into the history related to the fill pile in the Julian area and the Public Works yard down there. I'm going to talk about this recent activity. So on Tuesday, August 6th, I received what's called a DEP spill report in my email inbox that had come overnight. The DEP spill report is something we commonly get, a few a week. I got one today, and it's most often somebody's removing an underground storage tank with oil and it contaminated the soil. There was a car accident where some motor vehicle fluids leaked out. There was a spill at a gas station. And so it's very typical for me to get these. This one had a little bit different information when I reviewed it. It said, it listed Gould Manor Park, and it said shingles may contain asbestos shingles may contain asbestos, may contain PCB lead still on site. And I thought that was curious, so I actually drove over to the site to see if there was some activity going on related to some kind of, what DEP usually does in these instances. They respond, they engage a contractor, and they remediate the issue as soon as possible. And so I went out to the site to see if there was activity going on there. I did not see any. And then I noticed on the spill report that there was some contact information of the individual from the town was an officer from the police department. So I reached out to that officer, which was Detective Hines, and he then informed me about a complaint he received because of the activity around the individuals in the Julian yard. It was right when the arrests were happening or the warrants were issued. So he explained to me, he received a complaint from a concerned citizen about asbestos or shingle pieces along the sidewalks at Gould Manor Park. So, I received this information. He essentially told me that DEP was coming. He had contacted DEP. They're coming out tomorrow to do some testing. So that was Wednesday. And so hearing that, I went up, talked to Mike. Mike asked me to talk to Brian. Stanton Lesser was in a meeting with Brian at the time. So the three of us went out and we walked the park and we said, yep, there are what appears to be some shingle pieces along the sidewalk. And again, when we say along the sidewalk, it really was, within a few feet on either side of the sidewalk for the park. The next day, we met out there with the DEP individuals who were conducting the actual sampling. We met with Detective Hines and several of us, and with several people that were out there at the time, and they were collecting the samples. Based upon the information from Detective Hines that this was a project that happened back in 2013 where they replaced, they installed new curbs, they replaced the sidewalk, and then between the sidewalk and the curb, they had put some of this fill, and on the north side, if you will, the park side, maybe a foot or so just to level out the sidewalk. And so that was the information that was given to me. So we met there with the folks doing the sampling, and that day we inquired, so we want to take some interim control steps. We want to do something about what we're seeing here. And so later that day, I consulted with the police chief to make sure we weren't interfering with any kind of criminal investigation. We got clearance to take some interim control steps. We met the next morning with our local licensed environmental professional. So that afternoon, we actually contracted with Ty and Bond to assist us through this process. And we met with them the very next day at the site and reviewed the site, and then got approval to put in place some interim controls, which just consisted of every visible shingle piece that we saw. Before we even had any results, we went through and picked up pieces of glass and pieces of brick, and every piece of shingle that we saw, we removed just as an interim control measure to further protect the individuals in that area. So what happened then was sort of a twofold process. Right away we realized, okay, so this fill was being used in these types of locations, albeit here just a limited location. It's really an area of at most about 8 or 9 feet wide. But then we realized that this fill was being used in conversation with other sites around town. So right away we started inquiring and assembling a list of other sites around town, and we essentially put in place the interim controls at Gould Manor Park. We right away called DEP. We were already in consultation with DEP. They were at the site that day, and with the Connecticut Department of Public Health was called right away to talk about what types of, is there anything else they would recommend us to do now? We don't have sample results yet. This is what we're seeing. And they advised us, well, based upon the information that we have, based upon what we know about, we had available now lots of testing related to the fill pile in its current state, and they said based upon that information, we don't think any additional protective measures are needed other than what you did already. Pick up all the visible pieces that you can see. And this material that most of you might be familiar with, transite shingles, it very often contains asbestos, but it is a type of asbestos that's bound into a cementous type of material. It doesn't give off fibers easily. It's not hazardous waste. It's not a waste that requires a remediation contractor to take it off your house. It's on many houses, and a homeowner is allowed to take it off without respiratory protection, without gloves. They simply have to place it into containers and make sure it gets disposed of properly. So, given that information, we started the process of identifying other sites. And so later the next week, we started receiving some of these results. So the results were, initial results testing was done for what's called a toxicity characteristic leachate procedure. So this is a test done by DEP to determine if the materials on site are hazardous waste. And as has been announced already, none of the materials met any kind of levels to be considered hazardous waste. It did have some things that were elevated, but not above any kind of levels that would put it close to hazardous waste. We got those results. We immediately asked for a second set of test results to run on the same samples. They had enough material to run another set of samples, and that's called what we're calling a mass analysis, where it looks specifically at the amount of these particular constituents in the material to be able to compare that to the other test is about hazardous waste. This test is about direct exposure criteria. Does this material present meet a standard that it can cause some kind of health effect, or is it above some kind of standard that would be applied in a residential kind of situation? So we asked for that test. At the same time, parallel, around that time, Ty and Bond was also collecting their own samples, because what you need to do after that, once you find this scenario, is you have to define, sort of lay a grid on top of this, take lots of samples to define where exactly everything is on site. So that's what Ty and Bond started doing right away. And then we did get the, I want to make sure that, when we got the second set of results back, in the first set of results, I'll say we didn't find any PCBs, any herbicides, pesticides, volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds, any asbestos fibers in the soil, meaning those pieces of shingles weren't giving off fibers and getting into the soil. So all the soil samples came back negative for asbestos in the soil, but the soil pieces, the shingle pieces themselves did come back as having 8% asbestos. So, but 92% other materials, meaning that asbestos is bound in that materials like I described before. The mass analysis did come back looking at, there was 4 samples in that mass analysis that did come back above some of the residential standards. So, and I'm going to throw some numbers at you. I'm going to try to make it easy to understand. So 4 samples came back positive or above the residential standard for arsenic. So the level is 10 parts per million is what it is both for the residential and industrial standard for arsenic. Arsenic can range in Connecticut anywhere from 0 to 40 parts per million in naturally occurring soil, depending on the rocks under the ground. We asked DEP about these elevations, and they said these are marginal exceedances is the term they used. It's not anything particularly high. They said, we still obviously have to address them, and that's what we're planning to do, but they are not extreme exceedances. One of those 4 samples did come back positive or elevated above the residential standard for lead. And the residential standard for lead, in this case, the direct exposure criteria, residential standard, is 400 parts per million. So 400 parts per million is the level above which you have to take some kind of action. As you'll see in the video, the 400 doesn't mean necessarily that above 400, 401, 410, or even 506, that you're going to start seeing health effects from exposure to that material. It just means they want you to take some actions to do it. And in some cases, those actions, depending on the levels, is make sure you have a healthy bed of grass growing in that area so that when somebody's walking on it or touching on it, they're not directly touching that soil. As you'll see in the video, Meg from the Department of Public Health and for the state said, she doesn't start getting concerned with soil samples till she sees 20, 30, 50,000 parts per million is when she starts getting concerned about health effects with soil samples. So we've got some marginal exceedances that we need to address. We need to put in place some action. But she said, we asked her, is there anything additional we need to do? We have this information now. We know we have some exceedances. And she said, no, I think the interim controls that you've already put in place are sufficient. Most of the area has a very healthy grass cover, that this is not a residential area along the sidewalk where kids are digging and getting into the soil like that. There is activity in there, obviously, but it's not the type of activity that would yield any kind of significant exposure that would yield to a health effect. Yeah, and so that's where we were with getting that second set of samples back. I wanted to go back because in some of the information we put out when the first set of samples came back, the toxicity characteristic leachate procedure, we mentioned in one of the press releases that there was some barium found. When we did the second set of mass analysis, the barium was found all below residential levels, well below residential levels. So I want to just follow up on that. So at the same time we're reviewing the test results there, working with our partners from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Connecticut Department of Public Health, and with Ty and Bond guiding our steps. We said, whatever you tell us to do, we'll do. At the same time, we are working on developing that other list of other sites. And so we were very, very able to relatively quickly put together a list of sites where we had solid information from Public Works, from invoices, from phone calls that we received, emails that we received about sites that we could confirm that they did receive materials from the Julian fill pile during the time that Julian was operating it, and it was used on some of these sports fields and fields at schools and around town. And so right away we knew that was our priority list, and we had to take action, and we engaged Ty and Bond to begin sampling as soon as possible on those sites, using the information that we had on Gould Manor and the information from the testing available on the fill pile during the berm creation project and other testing done to guide what would be sampled for. And so that's their area of expertise. They look at those information, they say, all right, we think we need to sample for these things, and they're doing an expedited sampling of those sites this week. They started on Tuesday, they should be done tomorrow. They are going to 20 sites total, which include schools and other parks and fields where we have confirmed information that Julian fill from the period that they were running that aggregate pile was placed on those sites. There are a couple different areas around there. We have there are 2 playgrounds on the list, but the materials themselves weren't used in the actual playground area. They were used near it. So for example, one school had some materials placed under a sidewalk to create an accessible sidewalk to an ADA playground. And then another one down at Jennings Beach, about 100 yards from the playground, they had some work done on replacing a water line to the concession stand. And so a short portion of the grass, they had to dig it up, and they used some fill there to fill around that pipe. So those are some of the examples of the types of projects that we're looking at. Mostly the school soccer fields, it was the materials placed there was really as a result of the annual maintenance that goes on with those fields. If you've played soccer, you've been to soccer games, you probably know that the goalie box tends to get beat up quite a bit more than the rest of the field. So most of the work that we're talking about is they would come out, they would scrape the grass away, they would level out what was there. They would, if they needed, they would add a little bit more, and then they would put some topsoil on it, and they would either plant grass on that, or they would put sod in and put the little topsoil on the sod. And if it was in season and they needed to use it right away, grass if it was off season and they could give it time to grow. So that's the typical activity. There were 5 schools that received in 2015 a significant field renovation where they kind of dug up a big area from the goalie box forward and then each end and replaced it with fill. That fill was from the Julian pile, or a portion of that. What was used underneath was from there. The field contract, they received complaints at the time about glass and stones in that fill, and that fill was all taken out by Tarantino, who's now the field contractor for the town. Since 2015, they took out all that material and replaced it with material that wasn't from the Julian fill site. Regardless, those five sites are still being tested as we speak, and we're waiting upon test results. So with the list, we're going to test every site that we can determine received fill from the Julian fill pile that was potentially contaminated. And that's I say that it's a little hard to get down sometimes right to the nitty-gritty of, was it a product that was definitely contaminated? But in those cases, we're ruling in favor of, let's just test it. So our priorities were any schools with sports fields that we have confirmation of information that they received fill from the Julian fill pile during the time they were running it. Any other sports field around town that received the Julian fill during the time they were running it. Any other town recreation area where topsoil or fill from there was used. And then any other site in town where some of this fill or topsoil was used. And that's our priorities that we're moving forward right now. So we're in the first set of priorities right now, our school fields and sports fields around town. So I had mentioned that as the second set of results were coming in from DEP, Ty and Bond was collecting that grid sample, if you will, of samples. Those samples came in yesterday. Those were largely consistent with the findings that we had in the second set of samples from DEP, the phase 2 of those samples. There was 40 samples collected, 2 duplicates for quality control purposes, and they were analyzed for lead and PCBs and asbestos and petroleum hydrocarbons. They also did 18 different samples of building materials, including like brick and tile and other pieces that were found at the site. This is still Gould Manor Park. And then of those samples, 3 of those came back elevated for lead, above the 400. No PCBs were detected, no petroleum hydrocarbons, no asbestos in the soil was detected, similar to before, no fibers in the soil coming from those shingle pieces. And of the 18 samples of building materials, 9 of those came back positive above that 1% criteria that qualifies it to be considered asbestos. Again, those are shingle pieces of non-friable asbestos, meaning it doesn't give off fibers easily that you're going to breathe in. So as I said, right now we're sampling those priority sites. We're focusing on schools and sports fields right now. We hope to have those results coming in soon. They started on Tuesday, so we should have hopefully some results at the end of this week, by tomorrow, and then the remainder of the results coming in early next week. We tried to get all the results in, especially for the schools, prior to the opening schools was one of our goals. So I think and Meg's going to cover this, but all through this process, we've had several conferences with phone conferences with DEP, with Connecticut DPH, with Ty and Bond, and the team here at the town that's working on this. And so, we're constantly in contact with each other. We're asking them each time, is there anything additional you'd like us to do? So now we have these results. We know what's at the park. We ask them, do we need to do anything additional at Gould Manor Park or at any of the school fields, given that we have sample results in of the type of fill? And they advised us that, no, that given the condition of the fields, given the condition of the park, that we don't feel you need to take any additional recommendations at this point. Given that, we said, well, we want to lean on the side of more protective. So as we speak, there's areas at Gould Manor Park areas where we saw elevations, that those areas are being fenced off until a remediation plan is put in place and those items are taken out. And so that's the current status. We're at the beginning. We're at that first set of priority sites. We're going to continue until every site in town that received the fill-in question from the Julian fill pile during the time that they operated it is going to be tested, and we're going to figure out what kind of remediation action needs to happen, if any, and whatever the Connecticut Department of Public Health, Ty and Bond, or DEP tell us we need to do, we're going to do that, or even in some cases, as we're doing now, go beyond that to be more protective. So I'll conclude my remarks there, and I'll turn it back to Mike.
Well, thank you, Sands. Next up, I'd like to ask Jim Olson to come up from Ty and Bond and talk to about both our remediation approach and best practices in that area.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jim Olson. I'm a licensed environmental professional or an LEP. So I'm licensed by the Connecticut, and what I'm charged with is investigating and cleaning up sites according to the Connecticut remediation standard regulations. Time Bond, we're a 400-person firm based in New England. We have 2 offices here in Connecticut. I have over 30 years experience investigating and cleaning up sites in Connecticut, and I've worked closely with DEEP and DPH my entire career. So the town contacted me on Tuesday. I was down at the Gould Manor Park on Wednesday to look at the conditions and put together a plan to further define the conditions of impacted fill there. We were out there Thursday and Friday doing soil borings and delineating that, and Sands explained what those results were. So I can best characterize it as it's mildly impacted fill, just above the residential standard. You know, with my 30-plus years experience, I've seen plenty of sites all over Connecticut that have been filled historically, and I would classify this as like mildly impacted. And as Sands was explaining, you have this residential cleanup standard, and then there's also an industrial commercial cleanup standard. And DEEP right now is the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is currently developing some passive and recreational park standards. Those aren't done yet. So applying the residential standard to a park-like setting is actually very conservative. And again, these results were just over that standard. So we've completed our investigation. We've delineated the extent of impacted fill at Gould Manor Park. Right now, we're in the process of developing a remedial action plan. We're discussing that with DEEP and DPH, and that'll be implemented in the near future. You know, those conditions during excavation will be closely monitored. The dust will be controlled, and that material will be excavated and removed from the site, disposed of at a licensed facility, and it'll be replaced with clean fill. So, you know, the Gould Manor Park is fairly straightforward in terms of remediation. We do these kind of projects all the time. For the next major task, we have the 20 priority sites, and about half those are schools. So the town, you know, very concerned, you know, with the fill being present. About half those sites are schools, so we focused on those schools right away, and to date we've completed the sampling of those schools. We expect those results back on Friday. We'll be issuing those to the town, and so for the remaining 10 lower priority sites of the 20. We'll be completing those tomorrow morning. And the way we evaluate those sites is it's kind of like a 3-step process. You know, one, we met with DPW and discussed with them, you know, which sites and where fill was used on each of these sites. And some of these sites were soccer fields where in front of the goalies where you have a lot of wear and tear, or along the center line of the field, as Sands explained, some of these areas were kind of filled over historically. So we went to these sites, we made our own observations, and then we dug down through the turf and we sampled these targeted areas and collected samples for laboratory analysis. You know, once those results come in, we review them, compare them to these residential cleanup standards, and if they're above, we basically say, okay, then it kicks in the next step, which is like, what kind of measures do we need to, you know, protect the users of that field? And as Sands talked about at Gould Manor Park, we put up fencing. There's other things we can do, such as putting down mulch or geotextiles to protect it. I mean, it's really going above a level. I mean, actually, you could actually like leave those conditions at Gould Manor Park the way they are, be fairly protective, but the town wanted to take the extra step, and that was implemented. So you have the first step is investigation. The second, if they're above cleanup standards, are these interim control measures, and the third step is the remedial action. Like I said, we've done all the high priority sites. We should have those results by the end of the week. We're focusing on the next 10 priority sites. We'll have those completed tomorrow, the sampling, and those results will be available by mid next week.
Why don't we do the video? And we're going to play a video from Meg Harvey. She's with the Connecticut Department of Public Health in the Occupational Environmental Hazards section. So she is, and she'll explain it, the individual that I often turn to in issues that are complex and where we have to explain health risks to people. The one thing I neglected to say regarding this is, you know, this fill that was used is all fill that was used prior to December 13th, 2016. So since then, no contaminated fill has been used on the fields. And even prior to then, several of the fields were maintained by Tarantino. So there's a there. Personally, I don't have that answer. So yeah, we can look into that though. We can try to get that for you if you.
Okay, one, thank you for bringing that up. We would like to finish the presentation. I'm going to ask Ian to write that down to make sure that we get back with that answer. The 20 sites we were targeted were those we confirmed up front, and we want to make sure those get done. They're not the only ones. We're continuing to go through and evaluate invoices, so thank you for bringing that up. Sands, if you'd like to continue with the presentation.
Yep. So I'm just going to place the mic over here, get some audio.
Next up, we'd like to hear a little bit from Meg Harvey in terms of the State Department of Health, what their perspective is, and what guidance they are giving the town.
Good evening, everyone. My name again is Meg Harvey, and I'm sure I'm a new face to all of you. But I have actually been at the State Health Department, Department of Public Health in Hartford for 19 years now, working in the environmental health section, and in particular, the unit I work in, we provide really just advice, consultation, recommendations to primarily town health departments, health directors in towns all over Connecticut where there are environmental contaminants, environmental toxins in the environment, and people have questions about public health, about their exposure, about risks. And the unit that I'm in has no regulations. I administer no regulations. There are other groups at the health department that do. For example, the asbestos program has a lot of regulations, but my unit really is scientific consultation, technical assistance to towns. And I know you just heard a lot of chemical names thrown around, numbers, concentrations, parts per million, et cetera. And my goal, hopefully, I will achieve that goal, is to get all your questions answered tonight about what are these chemicals, what do they mean, and I have been working with Sands closely over the past couple of weeks since he first reached out to us to share the information that they had discovered that there was this fill at Gould Manor Park that was not clean soil, and what do we do? What is the best public health approach to take? And the important things to kind of keep in mind, I think, when you hear the chemical names and concentrations, et cetera, and standards, and marginally above standard or below standard. The thing to keep in mind, the most important thing, is the concept of exposure. And no matter what the chemical or the concentration that's in the environment, unless you have contact with it, unless you come into contact and that chemical actually gets into your body, there's no exposure. And if there's no exposure, there's no concern for health risk. So that's kind of number one overarching thing to keep in mind. The second thing is, even if there is exposure, even if you do come into contact with chemical in the environment, in this situation, we're talking about chemicals in soil, if you come into contact with the chemical and some of it does get into your body, yes, you're exposed, but that does not necessarily mean that you will have a health risk or a health symptom. Exposure does not necessarily mean health risk or health symptom or worry for health. In order to get to that point where we're actually worried about a health risk or health symptoms, you have to have enough of the chemical, a lot of the chemical, getting into your body, and that usually has to happen with many repeated exposures over a long period of time to chemicals that are present at high levels in the environment. So going back now to what we know about the condition of the soil that was placed at Gould Manor Park, obviously the data that we have tell us that that soil is not clean soil. That soil has material in it, chemicals in it that are not typical background. Yes, sometimes we see levels of arsenic. Arsenic could be background. Lead, yes, you'd never expect it to be zero, but pieces of asbestos-containing shingles, no, that's not normal, that's not background. And the levels of lead are more than what we would typically consider background. So when we have chemicals and levels, what do we use to compare them against? So really the only standards we have, public health standards for soil, are our residential cleanup standards for direct contact with that soil. We don't have standards for parks, for recreation, that type of exposure, that type of contact. So we use residential. Now, we all know that the strip of grass next to the sidewalk at the park is not residential. People are not living there. So when we say the levels of lead and arsenic in the soil were a little bit above our residential standards, that is not a concern at all in terms of health risk, because the way we come up with our residential standards, we assume a lot of soil exposure. We assume young children, as young as age 1, coming into direct contact with that soil while playing in their yard, directly in the dirt, lots of hand-to-mouth contact, that activity occurs 7 days a week, 365 days per year, and the kids are eating a decent amount of soil through incidental contact every day. That type of exposure we know is not occurring at the park. So these are all the sort of the things that I went through in my discussions with SANS and in my analysis of looking at the data. In addition, we're not dealing with bare soil. Grass is a great barrier between people and soil. Just as you know, if kids go out and they're playing in a grassy field, they'll come back with grass stains on their knees. Whereas if they're out playing on a field with no grass, they will come back with dirt stains on their knees. So the grass really does provide a good barrier from that direct contact with the soil. So, numerous conversations, over the past week or so, and my recommendations were that really nothing needed to be done immediately with that soil around the sidewalk, given the type of activity that happens there and the concentrations. But the town decided that they really wanted to kind of take an extra step and be extra protective and really, try to take every action that that would further reduce even, the most remote possibility that people could come into contact with that soil. And I think they're going to be doing fencing, I believe, kind of fencing off a little bit to help further reduce any possibility that people come into contact with that soil. And then as we move forward and get additional results from the additional fields that are going to be tested, I will continue to look at those results and give advice and consultation to the town.
This next part is just a few of the questions that were asked, and we thought we'd just play them right in a row and just finish the video.
Oh, thank you, Meg. So from the top, no one lives at these parks, but children are playing games, baseball, etc., multiple times a week, every week, 3 seasons, a year. Isn't that considered prolonged exposure? Meg, I'm going to turn that one to you.
So prolonged exposure relative to our residential standards, no, it's not prolonged exposure. It's still exposure. Playing multiple times, playing on a ball field multiple times a week for 3 seasons out of the year, yes, kids are going to be coming into direct contact with soil, yes. However, compared to what we assume happens in a residential setting exposure assumptions that we make are much longer. Children starting age 1 and living at the same house for 30 years, being in the soil every day, 7 days a week, 365 days per year, all 4 seasons. Those are the assumptions for direct contact with soil that are built into our residential standards.
Next up, my daughter is on a soccer field that's used several times a week. She plays goalie, and that comes covered in dirt, sometimes less, on her legs. If that soil were contaminated at levels found at Gould Manor, should she be concerned?
So I'll give the short answer first. Should we be concerned? No. Why do I say that? So the reason I say that is while, yes, exposure is occurring, direct contact to the soil is occurring, as evidenced by someone who is playing and getting arms and legs covered with dirt. However, the concentrations of contamination at Gould Manor, we know, are low. The arsenic level and lead level is marginally above the residential residential cleanup number. And I've talked already about how that is how we develop that number, what we think about, what our assumptions are in coming up with that cleanup number for residential. So it's not only that we assume a lot of exposure occurs, like 7 days a week, young children with a lot of hand-mouth contact. There's even more protectiveness built into those numbers, because when we develop cleanup numbers, we start with looking at toxicity of the chemical, usually in animal studies. That's where we start out. And then in making the assumption that it's not animals that are being exposed, it's humans, we add multiple levels of uncertainty and protectiveness factors onto our numbers. So that what we end up with is a cleanup number that has a large margin of safety built in. So you might be wondering, well, why? Why do you set your number so low that you wouldn't even be anywhere near a level that could be a concern for an actual health symptom? And the reason for that is because We don't want to have our cleanup numbers bumping right up against an actual effect level, a level of exposure. Let's use lead, for example, where our cleanup number for residences, residential yards for lead and soil is 400. We don't want that number to be so close to a level that could actually cause a child to be lead poisoned. We want that protectiveness because we don't want to worry when the soil level is 500 or 600 or 700. We start to worry with lead when the lead levels in soil are 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, which is what we see when there's lead paint on a house that has gotten into the soil. So that's the reason why I answer that question, no. Please don't be concerned, even if you know your child has a decent amount of soil exposure on a soccer field. Even if those contaminants were present at levels that we know were in the soil at Gould Manor, we have such a large margin of safety built into our numbers that exposure would put someone nowhere near an effect level, an actual symptom health risk level.
I am a parent coach who spends a lot of time on the soccer fields. This past spring, I noticed an increase in kids having breathing problems. Currently, my own daughter, who never had breathing problems in the past, is on 4 inhalers, and when I took her to the doctor, her lungs were only functioning at 68%. How can I find out if her new condition is connected to contaminated soil?
So the contaminants that have been mentioned in discussions about the DPW soil pile and the testing results that we have now from the Gould Manor Park, none of those chemicals would cause those symptoms that were described. So it is virtually impossible for contact with soil on the fields to cause symptoms like that.
Next, in 2016,
Questions that they're thinking about, worried about, that they don't necessarily feel comfortable asking in a public setting. So I have cards with my contact information. Please don't hesitate to grab one, give me a call, send me an email if you have any questions that are still lingering, or if things occur to you after this meeting, I'm happy to discuss any of those with you.
So we'll leave her number up there for you to jot down, and you can ask any questions. Mike has some comments here.
Oh, thank you, Sands. I want to step through a little bit of background and look at how we got here, and then we will open up the mic and have some questions. And as we're looking at that, we realize that one of the challenges in trying to get information out as quickly as we can to people is you're getting it out and you don't have all the answers yet. So we're in process, and we set up a web page so that we can keep all of our information, all the test results, and all of our updates, so those can be checked back at any time. We're trying to get emails out. We're trying to use Fair TV. We're trying to use every means we can to get the word out to people in terms of where we are. But the web page is probably the single best resource to keep in mind to see where we are. Our first priority in all of this, and my first priority in all this, is public safety. We're focusing our resources on understanding what town fields, parks, and other public areas received fill from the Julian Pile between 2013 and 2016, and testing those sites and quickly remediating those that need it. Our next priority, which has already been started, is to understand how this happened and what steps are necessary to ensure that it is never repeated. On this, I want to be very clear. It's apparent that decisions that were made and actions taken by certain managers in the Public Works Department were not in the public interest. Separate and apart from the ongoing criminal investigation, the public trust was violated and public health was put at risk. Regardless of great or small risk, it's still a breach of the public trust, and I will not tolerate it. So, going back, this all started in 2013 when our Public Works Department was trying to deal with about 40,000 cubic yards of accumulated spoils, street sweepings, soil that was, or material that was reclaimed from stormwater drains, and millings and asphalt from road work, as well as certain building projects. They had had a contractor in before that was working at part-time, but they had trouble matching up with their hours and making it available to Public Works when they needed to be. So they decided on a new approach, work with purchasing to come up with a RFP and certain criteria. And in 2013, that was put out to bid, and the bid was awarded to Julian. Things progressed on. There was a time, an email that I received, or was copied on, it went to Joe Michelangelo and Scott Bartlett in 2014 and 15, where a resident identified at Gould Manor Park there was a concern about asbestos there. That went directly to Joe. I was copied on the following email where they met with the resident, looked at what they were talking about, and addressed that, and looked at a following email where the resident congratulated them, or thanked them for taking care of that. Couple points here. One, Joe and Scott are people that are in the construction business, know construction materials, and know if something could possibly contain asbestos or not. In looking at this material, they should have identified that it might possibly contain asbestos. They should have notified the health department right away on that. So in that case, I'm more than disappointed that they didn't do that. Though that's the kind of trust that I'm talking about that we have in them and let down.
Mike, I'd like to interject, but you would know an email saying...
Excuse me? We'll have questions later, please. We're going to finish it. You'll have comments later. Thank you. In 2016, in January, February, I started getting neighbor complaints about the size of the pile growing. Starting in March of that year, we started meeting with the neighbors on a monthly basis to explain what was going on in the pile. We had biweekly emails going out. We set up a web page to track what was taking place, and I was getting weekly emails from Scott Bartlett showing the inflow and outflow from the pile to show that it was going down every week. And I got those through the entire year. In July or August, as we were putting pressure on Julian to get the pile down more, we also started getting complaints about truck noise and noise working the site. We had 3 different projects going on, both the Julian Pile project, the Regional Fire Training Facility, which was being built, and Penfield Pavilion. So that was a lot of truck traffic on Reef Road at the time. In September, based on the fact that we weren't seeing enough progress, regardless of what the reports were showing me, I notified Julian that we were going to end the project at the end of their contract, which was December 15th. As part of that, and in conjunction with the neighbors who were concerned about the quality of the soil and what was being put there, the quality of the material in the pile, I instructed Public Works to hire an LEP, a licensed environmental professional, to start testing. So the pile was tested for contaminants from September of 2016 through December of 2016. In November 29th, our LEP saw 3 trucks come in, first thing in the morning, with Julian labels on them, drive around the construction area, or the work area, and at the far end of the Public Works yard, deposit their loads. She thought that was curious, so she went over and tested those piles, took samples. On December 13th, those tests came back, and they came back positive for PCBs and higher levels of lead. So on December 13th, we immediately shut down the yard, kicked Julian off, and called DEEP to get their guidance. Sorry, 2016. Through DEEP told us to work with our LEP, come up with a remediation plan. So we tested out the soil to find the extent of that contaminant and took all of that contaminant off-site and disposed of it properly. Once that material is off-site, the pile was back to the original scope of material that was brought in. And by no means is that clean material, but it's construction fill. It's clean to the level of a commercial or industrial level. Not residential, as we've talked about, but commercial industrial. There are certain commercial and industrial applications or construction applications that soil is appropriate for, and that's what the basic Julian operation was. Take the 40,000 cubic yards of street cleanings, storm drain, residue, and road millings, mix it with that and create something that's clean enough to be used under roads or in other construction applications. Definitely not on ball fields or parks. Cleaning that material up cost us $300,000. That's what we asked Julian to pay for, because in their contract it says none of that type of material will be brought on by Julian. They refused to do that. That's why we're suing them for that money. We want to get paid for the work we did. It was their responsibility. We're currently in arbitration on that. At the same time, after discussing things with Brian Carey, Brian pointed out that the transport of that and the dumping of that PCB-laden soil might be a violation of certain state and federal laws. So I called up our police chief, Gary McNamara, and asked him to investigate that to see if any laws were broken in that transport or in that dumping on town property. In 2017, we continued to meet with the neighbors. Again, those monthly meetings, bi-weekly emails. We also brought in a landscape architect to design a berm. One of the things we were trying to address is that if we can build a berm around that, that would shield it visibly from the neighbors in the beach area, and also help be a noise buffer for that. So that would make us better neighbors down there. So that was designed. In fact, we had the neighbors involved in a workshop to do that. We designed the berm. We got approvals from Conservation, Town Planning and Zoning, and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And going into the spring of 2018, we built the berm. Now, in building the berm, we used soil from the pile, because as one of the construction applications, that's an okay use of that material. But also, just to be clear, we tested all the soil before we used it in the berm for two reasons. We want to make sure it's clean enough to be used in the berm, and it's because our public works people were doing the work, and we wanted to make sure they were protected. We used about 40,000 cubic yards. That's about 40% of the pile. So we have gone back now and tested 40% of the pile to make sure that it meets the standards that it should meet. In 2019, the search and seizure warrant came out, and the backup for that identified a number of things that were really troubling to everybody who read those. And because of that, I placed Scott Bartlett on leave. A couple weeks later, there were arrest warrants issued for Scott Bartlett, Joe Michelangelo, and Jason Julian. Coming out of that, I placed Joe Michelangelo on leave. And at the same time those arrest warrants came out, there was a complaint to police about Gould Manor and potential asbestos still being there. The police officer took that complaint directly to DEEP. DEEP, in their response, came down to inspect the site. They notified our Department of Health. We brought in Ty and Bond, as our consultant, so they were on board based on what came out of those tests that we would be ready to remediate right away. The report comes back with the presence of some contaminants. It didn't rise to the level of hazardous waste, but we still had some contaminants and material and chemicals we don't want in the soil, as well as shingles that potentially contained asbestos. The next step was to refine that testing, so we did a phase 2 test, and that came back with a profile that Sands had mentioned earlier in his presentation and the need for remediation. Last Friday, I did terminate Scott Bartlett. We also issued a list of 20 sites that were the first priorities we identified. This process involves taking invoices from the site, matching them up with public works tickets, identifying the site they went to, what the work was done on the site, and what the type of fill was used. Testing is done this week. We're hoping to have it finished by tomorrow. The results are coming back 48 hours or so after that. We are still checking invoices and matching up the work tickets, and we may, in fact, ask Ty and Bond to come in and do a more detailed review of that to make sure that we don't miss any possible sites where this was used. As these test results are back, we started to post those. We started to email those out, post those on Facebook, but also post those on the website so that those results are available to everybody out there to see exactly where we are. We've set up public meetings this week to make sure that we get out to the public, let you know what's going on. We're trying to make this as transparent as possible, but very clearly, this material should never have been used on our parks and ball fields. While it is appropriate for certain construction applications, it is not appropriate for parks and ball fields. Parks and Rec has closed the parks that are involved in our testing. Right now, the Board of Ed has taken steps to close some of their fields. We're getting the results back as quickly as we can, and again, we will proceed quickly with remediation to make sure our fields are safe as soon as possible. We're going through all of this, and we're going to use Fair TV, we're going to use the news media, we're going to use news and announcements section of our website. So if you want to sign up for that on the town website, you can get updates. You don't have to keep going back there to check. We set up a web page to contain all this material, and we're using Facebook and other social media. We want to make sure everybody's aware and can follow this along each step of the way. So with that, as kind of some background, I would ask that if you want to ask a question, if you just come up to the mic, I just ask you to ask one question at a time, and as we get through people, we'll have additional questions, and you can go back and ask second and third questions if need be. So if you'd like to come up to the mic, please go right ahead.
Hi, my question is a health question.
If you just, obviously I know who you are, if you would just
Jason
state your
Lee,
name.
245 Sunny Ridge Ave, live by Gould Manor. My problem I have with the Meg Harvey, not a problem, is she talks about kids playing soccer and stuff, so we're talking about an average healthy child. I want something clarified from the town without me just contacting Ms. Harvey. What about children that, or people with compromised immune system that aren't allowed to be in the school but use the outdoors as a way to get out of their situation, whether it's someone that's going through some kind of treatment or a deficiency? Because that's a whole different medical situation when you talk about that. When you talk about kids that can't even get their shots for school because their immune system can't take it, it puts them in a much different category than, let's say, someone running around playing soccer. So I think there's needs to be a broader discussion on that situation.
Okay.
I'll ask Meg that, and we'll try to put that information up on the website to see if there's something different for children with, compromised immune systems.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks for putting this all together and being here tonight. My name is Jennifer Jennings, and I actually live at Gould Manor Park. So constantly people were kind of saying, that nobody lives at the park. I live directly across the street, and I have for 22 years. In 2010, I started working from home, and that park became my office and my living room and my gym. I practice yoga in that park almost every day along the water. I took up hula hooping in 2010 and went across the street from my house every day to practice. So you can't assume how much people use a park or don't use a park. I walk across the street in my bare feet almost daily, sadly. I'm that kind of person. And literally take pictures from that park all the time. How lucky I am to work in this beautiful office. So in 2014, I started using that park as my office full time. My Wi-Fi reaches the park benches, and sat there every day working. So to learn all about this is pretty disturbing to me. At the end of 2015, I was diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer, as well as my cat, who every time I would come home from the park would roll on my shoes. And I thought, oh, she just really misses grass. And I thought it was cute and funny. So I don't know, who knows why either one of us had cancer, but I think it's very coincidental. I also will say that I've watched Phil being dumped next to my house continuously, year after year after year, in the long parking lot there, as well as a pile that was dropped at the end of my driveway on the side in the grass, because I'm the last house right before the long parking lot that's across the street from the park. You guys all know what I'm talking about? So Phil is dumped there constantly throughout the year, every year, over and over and over again. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes. So I don't think I saw any this past year, interestingly enough. Not much goes on over there without me noticing. I've watched you all. I was looking out my living room window going, what's going on out there, and why are they running around doing this? So you have those red fences up everywhere. And for people that don't know what's going on, maybe there should be a public sign or something that is included there, because those are up everywhere, but I think a lot of people don't know, and I'm seeing little kids running around through the park. And I know you're all saying that it's okay, the exposure's okay, but, who knows? Who
No, I
knows?
think the sign's a good idea. Could I just clarify on
Sure.
the long part? That's the one along 95?
Yeah, it's right along 95. My
Okay,
house
so-
is right next to it.
And Ian, make sure we have a follow-up on that in terms of, is that
Yeah.
town or state, Phil, that's going on there? Because do we know if it's town?
I don't know. The town chopped down one of my trees one year, and the town also dumped a pile right at the bottom of my driveway, but they said that was actually town property, and that stayed there. Personally, I think I'd like to have that area tested at this point. And my other question to you was, where were all these samples taken? How many were taken? What was the level above? You're just saying it was slightly above, but you're not really giving us those numbers. So
Oh, I thought I included those in my presentation. So.
you included what the average number is. I didn't think I heard the actual number that it came
So
back as being
The
reported.
lead finding on one sample was 506. So I said, 400, and the level found was 506. So that, per Meg Harvey's guidance, that's a marginal exceedance, well below
Right,
the level that
right.
would that the residential level of exposure would expect any type of health effects. And the level for arsenic was the level is 10. The levels found were 10.8 to 15.2. The range in Connecticut is 0 to 40 parts per million in soil. That can be found. Some pockets they can find it higher. But again, we're not saying we're saying it's above the level, and we have to address it. And
Yeah.
that's what those fences are about. That's what the remediation plan that's being planned right now, and the remediation of that entire area is about. That we're looking at any of those levels that are exceedances, and we're going to address those.
Okay, great. And so how many samples were taken from the park?
So there was, the first round of samples that DEP did, that was directed by, they directed that. They collected a total of 10 samples, but 8 of those were composite samples. So it's several samples taken, combined, mixed, and then a sample taken from that. So that way they can cover a greater area. One of those was a grab sample for comparison, and another one was a sample of the shingle pieces that were on the surface. So that's what those 10 samples comprised of. We asked those same samples, that same material, they had enough of it to run another set of tests. Those samples were analyzed for 71 different constituents. So they looked at a variety of different things of those 10 samples. Then we asked for additional things to look at in more detail into some of the metals. And then Ty and Bond took a total of 40 plus 2 controls plus 18 building material samples looking for asbestos.
Okay. And then just my own personal observation of that area of 22 years of living there. And I literally said this observation out loud to my neighbor. And one of the reasons I bought my home there 22 years ago in the fall of 1997 is it's such a beautiful park and it's so filled with wildlife. And over the past 5 years, I've noticed less and less and less baby geese, baby ducks, and baby animals there until this year we had none. And I don't know if that's coincidental or not. But that is my observation, and it was something that I even said out loud to my neighbor this spring when I was just like, oh my gosh, I think this is the first year that we've had 0. And just in the past, 5 years, I've, noticed them getting less and less and less. So who
Okay.
knows? But
Thank you
my
very much.
observation.
Is there any
Thanks.
more questions?
Good evening. My name is Shaul Praver. Thank you for being here this evening. I understand that the way that you're detecting the location of these the toxic hazardous material is based on contracts. You explained that so that this would become something known to the town based on different projects that were done to fill different fields, and that's how it comes to your attention. In 2016, Julian didn't announce through a contract that he was bringing in the hazardous material at the dump. And a neighbor had the good sense to call that in. And we caught him, didn't we?
It wasn't a neighbor who called him in. We had an LEP that we had hired,
Okay.
a professional to be on site testing the soil in the pile. She
All right, so-
tested it for 3 months without finding any contaminant, then literally saw the trucks come in and tested that. So
Okay,
we
so,
caught them in the act.
We pray much praise to that LAP that had caught him, okay? But you don't really know where else he dumped, do you?
Yes, we do. In terms of if in the pile area?
No, in general. You don't know if he decided to dump some of these hazardous materials in the Sound. You don't know other places.
We don't know anything about the rest of Julian's operation. You're correct.
All right. Have you tested the water?
Actually, I'm going to ask Brian to follow up with that.
The site, going back to 2013, did have a stormwater monitoring program that's required by the DEP. So there have been water samples that have been tested along Pine Creek, yes.
Okay. And that was in 2013?
It's a yearly ongoing monitoring program that's required for basically the whole Public Works complex, yes.
So every year this test was done on the water?
It's done semi-annually. They take tests from all the outfalls at Public Works.
All right. I'm confused on the dates. There was 2013.
So
that
the contract for the Julians started in 2013, and the operations at the site ended in December 13, 2016.
Okay.
The site was monitored as part of a stormwater management program even before 2013, because those permits are required for any public works type of facility. So there's a history of doing that type of monitoring at the site even before 2013, and that monitoring is continuing. The town is required to do stormwater monitoring for the transfer station operations, for the public works operations, and for the green cycle operations.
All right, so do I understand correctly that after you caught Julian in 2016, you fired him?
Well, we caught them 2 days before the contract ended. We kicked them off site as soon as we determined that there was contaminated soil there. If for no other reason, because it's public safety issues of having anybody working on site, we quarantined their equipment there. We called DEEP. They came back, told us to test the equipment. That was all wiped down to see if there are any PCBs on that. Then they asked us to develop a remediation plan that was subject to their approval. They signed off on it. We executed it to get all that contaminated soil off-site. So there was no more contaminated soil left on the pile.
Okay. Is there any attempt to actually speak with Julian through the judicial process in which he might be able to help himself by coming clean about other places where we might look or be concerned about? Any process like that where he might actually sort of Jim Morris, like the
Yeah.
tobacco thing?
So far, he's denied dumping the soil on our site,
All right. All right.
and we have an eyewitness.
All right, and then why are only 10 of the 20 sites sort of closed down before a conclusion of the?
All 20 are closed down. The
All right.
distinction is, and because there are two different communications,
Yes.
a number of people have raised that question. 10 are under the jurisdiction of the Parks and Rec Commission.
Yes.
So those were closed down by the Parks and Rec Commission. That was a memo that went out.
Okay.
10 are under the jurisdiction of the Board of Ed. They were closed down by the Board of Ed. So in essence, all 20 have been shut down, or closed. All right, it's just two different memos with partial information on both. So that I've gotten that question a number of times.
All right, I'm a little concerned about the residential versus the public park distinction, where a public park is considered to be of a lower standard of scrutiny. Yet, my kids, play soccer and sports, and they don't tumble around in the dirt and the grass in our backyard as they do in the parks, in the school. So I don't really understand the lower standard for a sports field rather than a front yard where we just drink lemonade.
Yeah. I'm going to let Sands Cleary
Sure,
answer
sure.
that.
So we're applying the same standard. So we're saying we're going to treat the standard that's being applied, that's guiding whether we have to take action to remediate, is the residential standard. Okay, and again, we don't set these; these are set by the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, with a lot of scientists coming up with this information and figuring it out and telling us this is the level above which we want to see abatement or some type of remediation action going on. So they're the ones who look at, kids. Yes, people roll around on sports fields and they get dirt on their elbows and things like that. Most of these constituents that we're dealing with are not dermal absorption. It's about ingestion. It's about eating that soil. And so what they determine is that most of the time, the people that most at risk these are very small children for things like lead poisoning. It's about in their yard, digging in the dirt and touching toys and putting things in their mouth. And that's where that primary exposure comes from. And it's not us setting them. We're not the ones setting them. It's the scientists at CDC and DEP and folks that say the residential setting is set at this level. We're using that same residential setting at the field. So it's not a different standard.
Thank you for explaining.
Sure.
Is the Long Island Sound okay? Can we swim at the beaches?
We test the waters every week for bacterial pathogens, and we've been having a really good summer.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who's next?
Hi, Mike. Steve Gordon, 1270 Fairfield Beach Road. Thanks, gentlemen. It was a good presentation. It was very informative. I may be redundant, but just to clarify it for myself, the berm has been remediated totally. That's my understanding from all the tests that were taken during its construction.
Steve, Mr. Gordon, sorry. I'm going to give you a short form answer to that, and I'm going to ask Brian to make sure that what I said is correct.
Thanks.
It's my understanding that what we did was take the material that we're going to use for the berm, and we tested it to make sure it was at the industrial commercial level, that nothing was above that. All right, so it was appropriate to use for a berm. We had a licensed environmental professional on site to do that. We did that for two reasons. As you well know, that we want to make sure the berm was clean enough to be used as a berm and a barrier there. And we also, because our employees were doing it, and we wanted to make sure they were safe. So with that, as a quick intro, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
So to answer your question, yes, so this is and documentation that was developed during the construction of the berm, which was put on the DEP website when that process was going on. There was numerous meetings and input from the public about the design criteria for the berm, and we talked about the process. But they did test the material as it was going on into the berm to make sure that it wouldn't exceed industrial criteria for pollutants. If that was the case, if it did exceed industrial level criteria under the RSRs, it would have to be segregated and removed off-site. That never happened. So all the material was placed in the berm, covered with topsoil, and then basically planted. The permit is still pending with the DEP. We're in the process of looking at installing a monitoring well network, which is required as part of the solid waste closure permit around the edge of the landfill. I'm trying to get a meeting with the DEP either next week or the following week just to work out some questions they had, and there was a little bit back and forth between our professional engineer and LEP Osprey Environmental, so that we can get the permit issued and basically have this thing closed out.
How long has it been pending?
So the permit was issued, the permit was submitted in April of 2018 prior to the process of construction of the berm. And it basically, they came back with questions in September 2008, October 2008 timeframe. There's normally a little bit of a lag time between them issuing questions and response. So it's been pending since April 2018.
Into April and what?
April 2018, since it was submitted, they have not issued the permit. So it's
Wow,
been
that's a long time.
But it's not uncommon for the DEP, if there's questions and back and forth, for that to take a while to resolve.
And it's your opinion you'll be successful?
Yeah, so I talked to Frank Gagliardi, who's the supervising engineer of the solid waste division, and he doesn't doesn't see having to move any more material up there. It's more about protective measures regarding putting in monitoring well network, which is required during any solid waste closure, which is what this facility is. It's basically a landfill. And as part of the landfill closure process, you need to have a monitoring well network installed so that you can monitor the waste that is in the landfill.
I'm sorry, and do you have the well?
No, so the wells are actually, we would hire a driller, and they'd come in and they would put wells at different depths around the edge of the landfill. That was all proposed, as part of the permit. There's design plans, engineered plans that were submitted. Those are all public record that were, put and placed up on the website prior to any work being completed. So, the location of those wells needs to be discussed with the DEP, and we'll move forward with that.
Great. And what's the timeline for that?
From my perspective, immediately. As DEP's perspective, that's why we need to sit down and meet. If they're going to, request us to do more, I don't know. I can't answer that question until I meet with them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, next.
Hi, my name is Beth Levinson Praver. I live on Greenbrier Road. I've heard you say that you have fired the people who are responsible, and you sound pretty angry. I work for a pretty large organization, and I supervise between 25 and 30 people. And when someone who screws up works for me, I call the person who is affected and I apologize. Because like so many things, it may not directly be my fault, but it's certainly my responsibility. This happened on your watch. And you say that you got an email saying that something was wrong and you counted on the people underneath you to remedy the situation. And when it hadn't been done to your standard, you fired them, but why didn't you follow up with them to make sure that it had been done? That's part of your job. You haven't apologized to anybody here in this room. You're full of righteous indignation, but my kids have to go and play soccer on that field starting on Monday.
Ma'am, the first email that I sent out, first update, said I was sorry for the incident and the anxiety and concern and fear that this was calling. If there's any question, yes, I am very sorry about this. It did happen on my watch. All right? I did follow up. At the time, I got emails back that said it had been handled. Right?
Did you ask how it had been handled?
I did not. You know, when I hand something off to our police chief and he tells me it's been done, I have to trust him that he's been done right. Same thing with our fire chief. Same thing with Public Works is a big business in its own right.
It is a big business, but if you don't follow up to ask how things have been handled appropriately, then how are you ultimately responsible?
In my job, I get hundreds, if not over 1,000 emails every year pointing out every issues from trees that need to be cut to potholes that need to be fixed. I do send those on to department heads. When it gets back from the resident and from the department head that it's been resolved, right, I do accept that answer. A lot of times it'll come back with the resident, they're not happy with that. And I will continue to follow up and make sure that we do what's right, or I understand what's taken place and why we can't make that resident happy.
I guess that wasn't good enough. Thank you.
I'm going to tag in here for a moment because I'm going to continue that, because when you say you did follow up, tell me how this is following up. This is an email I sent to you, Joe Michelangelo, and Scott Bartlett. It was addressed to Joe because he was the first person I sent to. Last fall, topsoil and seed were placed on the top of the debris in the area between Gould Manor Pond and the old playground. The debris was not removed, it was covered. Is covering it proper remediation? The area along Holland Hill Road in front of the ball fields, between the bathrooms and the corner of Crestwood Road, still has exposed debris. Below is a photo from this morning. There were large pieces of glass and asbestos. I know it's asbestos siding because I had it removed from my house. I paid to have that remediated. I know exactly what it looks like, and it should not be at a ball field, at a playground where people live and reside and use the space. I continued and said, I do not see how it is possible for the debris to be missed when it was put down initially. I do not see how covering half of the problem solves the problem. Please fix this. Dana Carey. It wasn't until I reported this to you. It was spoken about in January of 2014 to Joe and Scott. I reported it to you in August of 2014. You did nothing. You replied to me, thank you for following up. You did not contact SANS. You did not enter into any of the actions that happened when I called the police department. And the only reason that we're in this conversation now is because I called the police department, because I called the state's attorney and said, I've been talking about this since 2014. I spoke about it in 2017. Now here we are in 2019. How many flags do I have to wave for somebody to listen? That's not following up. You should resign.
We do have an email from you saying thank you to Joe Michelangelo and Scott for taking care of the problem. And in response to your, excuse me, I let you talk. I would like the same courtesy. I do have an email from you saying that.
I did, when Scott remediated and removed the debris from that second half of the pond. But his email to me when he got there to meet me was, and I can read it to you exactly, was, Dana, I don't understand what my highway foreman didn't see. This is crystal clear. So why couldn't you get in your car and from Town Hall go over to Gould Manor to see the asbestos that was all over? This was unacceptable. This was 2013. This was 6 months in that this started with Julian. You had the opportunity to get ahead of it, and you didn't. I walk my dogs in the conservation areas. I have a few other questions I can ask you, but I'm going to let everybody else go. This is something that tags right in with, you did not follow up. You breached our trust.
Yep. I absolutely expect the Director of Public Works and our Superintendent of Public Works to know what is asbestos or what might be asbestos, and then to take the appropriate action. When it came back, I absolutely assumed they did their job, that they were technically qualified to determine if that might be asbestos, and if it was, they should have contacted the Public Works.
We both know what happens when you assume.
Sherry Myro, and I live on Stevenson Road. I'm not going to thank you for being here, because that's your responsibility to be here to the taxpayers who voted you into office. From last night, I was at that meeting also, and asked the question on when kids weren't supposed to be on the field, and the small little signs that were put up stating that those fields were closed, and I witnessed children still playing on that. I am going to thank you for having those fields now cordoned off. I drove around town, and the fields that are being tested are cordoned off. That I will thank you for. That should have been done before. Now, the fact that we are suing Julian, we all know that that's going to take a long period of time. What guarantee do the taxpayers of this town have that our taxes are not going to go up because this is an expensive endeavor? My other statement is, or my other question is, we're done with Julian. Why are we still paying him rent for property on Meadow Street?
Yep.
Am I correct?
You are correct. The Board of Ed moved their construction facility, their kind of maintenance group in there, I want to say almost 10 years ago, long before Julian owned it. Julian bought it about 2 years ago, 2 to 3 in that range. We currently don't have a lease with them. We're not going to continue with a lease with them. However, we haven't found another space. The Board of Ed is out looking to see as soon as they find another space, because we're on month to month, we will move everything to that new space.
I'd say that needs to be done very soon.
Here, I'll tag you with that. Can you explain to us your relationship with Mr. Julian? Thank you.
The question is, what is my relationship with Mr. Julian? It's showing Mr. Julian when he was ringmaster of the Barnum Festival. And it's a picture with me and Mr. Julian at a fundraiser for the Barnum Festival.
My name is Melissa Held. I live on Tuller Road. Excuse me. There was a new development on Serenity in which there's wetlands. They had to put a road in there, so the development of the houses was private, but the road was public. My question is, I don't know what the town did for the whole wetlands and water drainage issue. Should those residents be concerned, because there is water that does come down that's collected, and there's lots of new families with young kids, and there's grass, there's pavement, but there are areas in which kids could play. So I wondered if it could be tested. Does it need to be tested?
So that whole development was actually private development. So if a subdivision is approved, Tuller Road, the construction of the road is actually the responsibility of the contractor. So the town has had no fill or anything placed there. I'd have to go back and look at who the exact contractor was who built the road, but that's whenever there's a subdivision, that's private development until the roads are built to town standards, and then the contractor literally turns the keys over to the town after the road is accepted by engineering and public works and planning and zoning. And there's bonds in place in case the contractor does not do that work.
Would that contractor have come to get any fill from us?
From the town, generally not. I mean, I don't know where every contractor purchases their fill before they're, doing road work, but I mean, that's not something the town necessarily tracks.
Okay, thank you. That's where Teller School was, yeah.
Yeah, so it's normally a group of tradesmen that do the work, so there's someone who'll come in and do the site work.
Hi, Bill Gerber, 25 Shady Hill Road. Do we, I'm a little unclear, I may have missed this in some of the write-ups. Are we clear about whether any of this fill under discussion went to third-party contractors, or was it all used by DPW for Fairfield projects?
So, yes, the Julians were selling construction material to third-party contractors. Most of what was being, they were making several products there, crushed stone, topsoil, things like that. Various construction materials. It wasn't just all fill material. That was what they're selling. But that's one of the things that we tried to obtain from the Julians immediately after closing the site was actually the scale tickets that tracked what came in and came out. I don't think that's been. I think that the lawyers are in receipt of that. But to try, their records were kind of a mess, so it doesn't necessarily tell you where all the material that they sold was going. So if you were a contractor, you needed 20 tons of 1.25 inch stone, you'd come in, they'd load the truck, they'd give you a scale ticket, and you would drive off. They were not keeping records of necessarily where all that material was going. But most of the material, I can't tell you how much of, stone, aggregate, fill they were selling out of that site. Those are their private business records.
Okay, so the fill in question, we may find out that some of that is in sites outside of Fairfield, and we may be hearing about that in the future?
I don't know.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Just had a brief question. Are the playgrounds being tested?
So we have on the list, the priority list that's being tested right now, there's 2 areas near playgrounds, but the playgrounds themselves, we have no records of any fill from that period of the types being used directly on playgrounds. There's at Mill Hill School, there was an ADA sidewalk put into the ADA playground that used some questionable material that is being tested or was tested already, I believe. And the Sandcastle Playground had about 100 yards from the playground itself, the structure, off sort of, closer to the beach, in the far corner over to the side there. From the dead-end street there, I forget the name of that street, but they connected a water line to the concession stand. They replaced a water line to the concession stand, and they used some of the fill in that trench.
Okay. So no other playgrounds are?
So what the school system has asked for a proposal and is looking to test additional areas. And so, I'm not sure of the entire extent of that, but they're looking to test additional areas, and I believe playgrounds may be a part of that. I don't know, Jim, are you aware of that?
Yes, we were approached by the Board of Education to test all the schools. They gave us an additional 16 schools to test across town, and they said to focus in on the sports fields. So we put together a proposal, submitted that today to the Board of Education.
Okay. Would that also include the playground that's near the beach? Would that be tested, or?
I don't recall the top of my head. What's the playground called?
think it's near Jennings Beach.
That's Sandcastle Playground.
Oh, that's Sandcastle,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, all right.
Yeah, we have no records of Phil being.
Sands with the mic?
Yeah, we have no records of Phil being placed at the playground itself. It was, it's over to the side, just with that pipe, and they said they used some fill there, and then they said some of the trucks put some ruts in there, and they kind of filled in there too.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, so basically what it sounds like, until the invoices match up, we kind of still don't know where the fill could be. We just know the first 20 places. It could be more, it could be no more, until you match up the invoices that you're looking at on where the pile went to. And then the other issue is the third-party contractors that bought, we don't know where they took their soil. If projects in town use that third party, and dump that soil, we still really don't know, except for the first 20 you mentioned.
So there's the 20 that were the priority. We definitely have more, but we want to be absolutely sure because, not all the products that came out of there were subject to contamination. So we're matching those up. But yes, we're working on that list. We have more. We're going to announce more. We're going to continue. And I had shared sort of the 4 categories of sites that we're working through. And, we will get to every record that we have. We've obtained every invoice that the town paid to Julian to purchase that fill. We have those from that period, and we are working to match up, where did that, as Selectman Trento said, where did that invoice go? Where did it go? Where on the field did it go? What area was it used in? Was that particular product used subject to contamination? So those are all the questions. So we're going to continue. We'll have more lists, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Dana Carey, Green Acres Lane, Fairfield. So continuing, so my question is, and I know we have this list, but I'd like it to be on so that everybody understands. I'd like to know how many cumulative cubic yards were processed through the fill pile from 2013 to 2016. When I walk my dogs through, when my kids would play rugby at Oldfield School or football at at Sullivan Field, I would walk my dogs through that area, and it's an enormous area that goes from Oldfield School down through the marsh area to Old Dam Road. There's another path that goes up to the left, and then there's an enormous clearing that's up there that is constantly shifting. That's an enormous area. I don't even know, Brian, you probably do, how many acres are in there?
I mean, there are records of how much material is processed through those. Those are Julian's business records. So,
but how many acres is that area between Sullivan Field, Oldfield School, and then down to?
So there was a path built back in, I think it was, I have to check the time frame. I think it was like 2011 to 2013. I have to check exactly when that was constructed, but it was before the time when the Julians were operating the site. So I have to check, is the bottom line.
The path was initially built, but it was more recently that fill area that's in and above. So as you're going, like there's the waterway where there's ballasts that allow water to go in and out. It's the red balls that float up and down with water closure.
Yeah, so anything that would be deposited on the top, I'm not quite sure if we were using fill from that pile, but most of the stuff that conservation does use was purchased separately, either through Green Cycle or top dressing like that, but I have to check.
And this definitely is not, this was where more recently that fill was put down on.
So no fill has been brought out of that site since 2016.
Right, but what I'm saying is this is when my kiddos were playing 4 years ago.
Okay. All I have to say is I have to find out when that was done.
Right, and then I know the softball field is being tested, and when the firing range, the police firing range, was worked on.
So we generally use millings for top dressing, paths, to a smaller degree, which is not fill. It's just reclaimed asphalt.
Okay, I understand that, but when I walk through that area, That's not reclaimed asphalt. Please test that. Please add that
I'll
in,
have to look
and
at it.
Please
and
let me know.
see.
Like, I'd like
I mean,
that
it's
posted.
visually obvious what is fill material and
Yeah.
what is not, so we'll be able to see what.
It's visually
what that was.
obvious that it's not, like, it's not, should not be there. My next question is, so in 2016, it was discovered that Julian had a bad bid process, and that their bid was a fraudulent bid. And in 2018, there was a town audit done by Connie Saxel. The inaccuracies that were reported, there were 41 inaccuracies. The DPW employee said that she was not confident in giving a changeable document to Mr. Michelangelo. I'd like to understand, at that point, why did we not address questions about inaccuracies of financial reportings, questions about inaccuracies of what were we paying for that we're not supposed to pay for as a town. We weren't supposed to be paying for the fill, but we were. And there's a lot of, why was that not addressed?
At the time, that wasn't brought to my attention. We're going back now, and we're going to have our independent auditor go back and review all of that to make sure exactly what was happening. Finance Department has taken the first look at that, and they've gone back and reconciled those numbers to make sure that the town didn't lose any money in that, that we're financially whole. However, we want an independent look at that, so that's what I've asked our auditor to do. Board of Finance is also looking at that, so we're going to do a Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance will do a joint charge to the auditor to get that done.
Okay, just as a comment, if the rest of your residents of Fairfield could go on the premise of, I didn't know, I couldn't do anything about it because somebody else was responsible. You're our first selectman. You are the CEO of our town. This was not acting responsibly.
Actually, as soon as we identified that Julian was coming, I brought in the LEP. We would not know any of this if I didn't bring in the licensed environmental professional to test the soil.
I'd like to know why the
We
rest of
wouldn't
the
know
selectmen
what
aren't
was
here.
in, excuse me, if I could finish. I was kind enough to let you finish. We wouldn't know this, and the reason even that information came out is because I requested the police department investigate the criminal aspect of this, and that's where a lot of that information came out, but it's also come out fairly recently in the background to the affidavits. That criminal investigation is ongoing. Folks will have their day in court to prove where that is or where that is significant. However, we are bringing in the independent auditor to make sure that our financial controls are up to snuff and are what they ought to be.
Okay, I'd like to know where the other selectmen are this evening. The other selectmen should be part of this process. They were part of the conversations. Why is Ms. Knight not here this evening?
I'm sorry?
Why is Ms. Knight not here this evening, who discovered the testing, the original tests, or the original trucks that came into the yard?
Is there a, Brian, you wanna-
I would say that, as far as the remediation of the pile, that was all, publicly discussed when it was going on. We went to numerous meetings. I went to Board of Finance. I mean, that was discussed ad nauseum publicly.
Except it didn't result in what we needed to actually know.
Well, there was the
That's
criminal
where we are now,
investigation came
3
out
years later.
afterwards, is where, we're kind of at this point. But we thought that was limited in the scope to what we remediated. I mean, when we found out there was a problem that was illegal dumping on the site, we shut the site down immediately, called DEP, covered the pile, made that well known that was an issue. We went through a public process to tell everyone, yes, this happened. We closed the site. We're hiring an LEP. We're coordinating with the DEP to basically address the contamination, remediate the contamination, and go forward in a public charrette, get the public's information, input on what they wanted to do with the piles, since we were basically on notice from the residents of Fairfield Beach Road that, it was unacceptable to be running that type of aggregate reclamation facility. Everyone, that was all done through public process. So to say that we knew that the scope of this was going to get this bad, I didn't know that at the time. I think it was revealed after the criminal investigation in my part. And, you know, again, it's an unfortunate situation, a very unfortunate situation. We're trying to be as proactive as we can. And, you know, this is a data-driven process. And, you know, we're letting the data drive our response, and we're actually going beyond that. You know, to get back to your question, you know, everyone was well aware, you know, about the remediation. And Cindy Knight is not part of this process going forward, which is what we're discussing tonight.
Okay, please invite the other selectmen.
I can't hear you.
Please invite the other selectmen to the next meetings.
Thank you. Yes, they were
Mr.
notified about this one, along with everybody else, but thank you.
No, to sit next to you. They were part of the process. Please invite them to sit at the table.
Thank you.
All right, one more bite of the apple, Shaul Praver again. What's the contingency plan if the soil comes back bad? Where will the soccer be held? You know, how is the town going to function if it's not up to par?
I think that contingency plan, for the most part, is going to be something that the Board of Ed has to address, but Sands or Jim, can you help with that?
So, you know, any sites that are elevated, similar to what's happening at Gould Manor Park now, is that we're going to restrict access to those areas that are elevated, and we're going to put in place a remediation plan. In terms of the activities, we'll have to rely on the recreation department to do some of the rescheduling. You know, we're going to have some results soon, so we'll know, you know, if these sites are suitable to be reused. So some of these fields will probably come back with levels that are acceptable. Some may not. That's what we're waiting to see. But, you know, we'll rely on the recreation department to plan accordingly with their activities based upon the fields that they have available.
So you don't really have a contingency plan to share at this moment. It's the towns and park that we're looking towards for that. Is that correct?
I would, you know, yes. I don't have any authority to tell them where they can and can't play soccer at this point, other than, you know, my role is to help oversee the testing and the fields.
Okay. But
And to be fair, that's why we're getting the testing back as quick as soon as we get it back, then we'll know what we have to make contingency plans for.
I mean, okay, but if they're all bad, then you don't really know.
Then
what
if it's
we're
all
gonna do.
bad, it's a much worse situation than if they're not all bad. So we've got to get the results back so we know exactly which sites need to be remediated. They may not all be.
All right.
Second, we often have to know where on the site it has to be remediated and what that can take. So that'll be a set of priorities in terms of what we can fix quickest and soonest and get the most fields back into play and operation as soon as possible.
Okay, I understood that. And Scott Bartlett, Joe Michelangelo, and Mr. Julian. Well, Scott and Joe were fired recently.
Scott was terminated. Mr. Michelangelo is still on administrative leave.
And okay. So, but you caught Julian in 2016.
Correct.
And these firings, or actually only one termination and one sort of pending in a quasi-administrative leave status, is happening many years later. What led you to the conclusion that they should be terminated, etc., in 2019? What new knowledge came to your attention that you didn't know in 2016?
I'm going to suggest there's a lot of new information that's come out in the last 2 weeks, and that's what we're evaluating.
Okay, I think probably my final question for this evening. I understand that there was a criminal investigation after the dumping, but the impact of this particular crime is something that affects all of us. at that time, we didn't know the scope of it, and we still don't really, right? So while you might get the bad guy, we still have to drink the water. We still have to play in the soccer fields and the baseball fields and make contact with the earth and the dirt. I'm not in this field, but I have seichel, common sense, that if it's a problem that affects possibly the health, the public health of all of the citizenry here and everybody, why is it enough just to have put one man behind bars when the real concern is the public safety and the public health? Why is it done that way? And, I understand you get some directives. I work for the state, too. I'm a chaplain in the prison. So if you also let me know, by the way, where Julian is housed, I'll pay him a pastoral visit. But aside from that, what do you gentlemen think about not informing us about the potential health risks of these places and our drinking water, and just putting your energy into catching the one bad actor? Does that seem like a good process, or would you, if you were in charge, would you change that in any way?
I would suggest what you described isn't what happened. In fact, the police investigation, which we're not involved in, has been progressing on checking if there's any criminal activity or illegal activity. What we've been addressing almost full time since we became aware of it is getting the sites identified, sites tested, and getting any remediation to make the fields as safe as soon as we can.
Okay, so why did it take from 2013 to get the LAP testing? That's a lot of years from 2013 to 2019. Why did it take so long, if I'm understanding correctly, to get those tests done? While my kids were, rolling around in the fields.
Yep. A couple of separate issues there. One is that it was December of 2016 that we identified the PCBs that had been dumped in a pile.
Right.
We addressed that, took those away, and made sure that those were properly disposed of off-site.
Right.
So the pile is back to being appropriately commercial industrial material or aggregate. There's nothing illegal, wrong, or contaminated about that.
Okay.
All right.
And 2013?
2013 is when Julian signed a contract to take over the pile and the management of that.
Okay. Were you pleased with his resume from his previous work? Any indication of this kind of illegal dumping in his previous contracts? Any complaints that you investigated before hiring him that you knew about?
Our purchasing department went through an RFP process. They were awarded the bid. In going back and reviewing that, I've sat down with our purchasing department starting in 2016 as soon as we identified some of the inconsistencies with Julian Enterprises, and we revamped our purchasing process to make sure we did a much tighter job verifying and validating the information that comes back on the answers. So no, we were not as thorough in 2013 as we should have been.
Okay, because and what do you know about him now in 2019 about some concerns about this kind of behavior in other projects? What, and if anything at all, what do you know at this point in time?
There's been a lot of information floating around, and certainly the affidavits made a number of allegations about Julian Enterprises that we're going to evaluate.
Were those available in 2013?
No, the police detectives only released those, I think August 7th, 8th, or 9th. They were made public of this year.
So he was squeaky clean before August 7th and 9th?
I don't know about squeaky clean, but he passed our RFP process, and as I said, we've gone back and tightened that up so that won't happen again.
how did you tighten it up? What were some things that you did that you thought you should have done at the time?
Sat down with our purchasing director, had him go back and look at every single thing that we learned about Julian and the issues we're having with Julian, had him do a point-by-point improvement program for the bid process.
I mean, for the next bid, that's an individual that you investigated and you found some stuff.
We improved the process to make sure that whenever we do an RFP in the future, we will validate the data much more thoroughly than we did then.
How would you do that? How would you validate it? Like what improvements? Like the next vendor comes down the pike, you know, maybe even the guy that's going to clean it up or some other person. What are the specific salient lessons that you learned in this process?
There were several different points, but one is literally going back and verifying, being more thorough about checking the answers that come in and not believing the answers that are written down, to make sure we verify those with a third party or some other outside source.
You mean
Probably
like
it's the simplest thing to do.
Cross-referencing and calling different people that are cited on his resume and that kind of thing?
Correct.
So that wasn't done?
I don't believe it was done as thoroughly as it needed to be.
All right, no more questions. Thank you.
All right, if that's it for questions, I want to thank you very much.
Lisa Simmons, Godfrey Road. Has any of this filled? I walk dogs for a living, and for the last year and a half, I have a new client. We walk past Gould Manor on the sidewalk. The dogs walk on the grass. If it's really hot, I don't want my dogs walking on this, the asphalt. It's just too hot, so they walk on the grass. They go back to the house. They do a little wrestling. They're licking their paws and licking each other. I mean, obviously, I'm going to have to talk to either Meg or my vet to find out if there's any health issues with that. But, I've been doing this for 25 years. And, I also go to, Lake Mohegan with the dogs. I've gone down to South Pine Creek. I mean, are those places being tested for these, whatever, for arsenic?
Sands, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we have a number of sites on the list that are going to be tested. Every site where we can confirm that there was fill from that period used at a site, that site's on the list. Until we find information that rules them out in some way, somebody might say, well, that particular product wasn't subject to contamination that they generated, then that site may be ruled out, but that's why we're working with an independent contractor to kind of to verify that data, validate that data. But yeah, we're going to work through every information that we have where Julian fill was used by Department of Public Works and placed on different properties around town. That's what we've said is all those sites are going to be tested.
Okay. And correct me if I'm hearing this wrong, but we hired Julian to get rid of a pile, which now I'm hearing that, okay, they're getting rid of this pile. I don't know where they're going to get rid of it. Are we buying our own dirt, like our own fill to use on sites? Were we buying our own dirt, stuff we owned? That's like renting my own sneakers. It's like...
Do you want to try that, Brian, or you want me to?
I'm not completely sure about that question.
If we have fill that we own
Yes.
already,
so
why
we
are
were
we
bringing
paying Julian.
So there was an existing fill pile there that was, so quote unquote unusable or unsuitable material, and the idea was to have them come in and basically process that material with additional material that they brought in, so that the material, once processed, could be used as, clean fill, meaning that, could be used as burrow material for construction sites.
Okay.
So there was a process, meaning they'd have to put it through a crusher, put it through screeners, big equipment, that's worth millions of dollars.
Yeah, I'm familiar with
that the
kind of
town would not purchase, just because it was beyond, an operation that we would run internally. And then we would process, we would get material back from them at a discounted rate. Okay. So some of the material that they'd end up making would be 1.25 inch stone after they were able to, process the pile. And that's not something the town would be able to, take broken sidewalks, crush, and make it into a usable product that we could use on other properties.
Right.
And, there was, I don't know exactly how the contract was set up, but there was discount prices for getting that material back to the town.
Oh, she's not
Yeah,
here,
and
but
we
I-
were also able to bring in asphalt millings and things that generally might cost us money to ship out and dispose of. They were able to, take and process. The idea was to run a aggregate concrete recycling facility.
I don't see her, must have left, but the woman that lives across the street, I agree with her. I've been walking along Gould Manor for, I'm trying to think how, I started with one dog on Jennings Road, and that's part of our loop, and now I walk another dog that's across the street from them. One thing I have noticed is there is a lot, when we walk along, part of the fun was like, see how many frogs we could get to jump in the pond. We haven't had one frog this year jump in the pond. I've seen one turtle. It was like this big. And
So, just
I
to
really
go back
have
to
noticed
that,
there's less wildlife
they-
down there.
I will tell you, things are variable. The levels of pollutants that are adjacent to the site are not going to be something that is going to cause a aquatic toxicity issue. Things are cyclical. The reason why there's frogs there one year to the next could be, it's more of an environmental variation. I drove by there 3 months ago and there was a bald eagle there. So, I haven't seen a bald eagle there in ever. There's variation in the
I
environment.
saw one on Cross Highway.
Yeah. So there's variation in the environment to try to say that because there's lead and asbestos that's been out there for a couple of years that there's no longer ducks or geese. That's not, there's no cause relationship there. The Gould Manor is basically receives stormwater from the surrounding area, and it's
Right.
There's no causal effect between the lead and that type of situation.
All right, well, thank you for now. Are there any other questions out there?
Yes.
Please.
So can you please post online the Julian contract that was signed in 2013?
Yeah, I think it's already been posted on the PW Yard site. That was
Okay.
one of the things we
I
did
will-
as part of
I will
our whole
double-check and I will look for
review
that.
with the neighbors at that point.
Okay, my understanding is that part of that contract was that the fill that we received from the fill pile was not supposed to have a fee to it. And it sounds as if that is not in alignment with what Mr. Carey just said, so.
Honestly,
Well,
I'm
so
not
I'll go back.
the authority on that.
Yeah.
So
I would say, please review the
Yeah, I absolutely will
contract.
review the
And then,
contract. And then referring to, for the animals, and so there's probably not this past summer, the 2 summers ago, the water coming into the pond looked like the Chicago River on St. Patrick's Day. It was antifreeze green. The police department or the fire department were there, so there was something that was in the water at that point. It was just about,
when was that?
it was probably 2 years ago. It was in the summertime.
It was dye testing.
I'm not.
So routinely, we'll go out and check storm sewers and dump dye in there to see if there's a break in the pipe. It's
Okay.
it's a non-toxic chemical.
Okay.
It's pretty routine. I mean, so.
It was
you know,
alarming to the neighbors when they all posted on
I
Facebook
understand.
of, why is this green?
I understand. I mean, all the surface water bodies in town are connected to the storm sewer. So unfortunately, that's part of urbanization. So if you have a tanker truck or a fuel oil release, it is going to collect in these receiving bodies. But that's something that, Sands and I will go out there immediately and abate if it's a, hazard or if there's a environmental condition.
Okay, super, thank you.
all right, is that a question coming up?
I know you guys talk about sorry, you guys talked about the parks and the schools, but you guys really didn't talk on the bus yard. which is right next to the landfills. And I know it gets filled a couple times a year. I don't know by what company or anything like that.
Sure. I can speak some to that. So I received this question from the shop steward, I think it was, and I asked Public Works, what do they use to fill the potholes and fill the lot there? And they said that would be exclusively asphalt millings, the same thing we use everywhere else in town to patch potholes and the like, that it would be a very common use to do that. My understanding, asphalt millings have their own issues with them. They're hydrocarbons, and but that use is appropriate, and so you would get the same kinds of effects on a newly paved road or anything like that. That you would be exposed to the same kind of things. But in terms of what we do have as data, so. The testing done to the berm, 40% of the overall pile, gives us a good indication of what types of things were found in the overall pile over the time. A good idea. It's not perfect, but it gives us a good idea. So when they were constructing the berm, over 3 months, on 3 separate days, 5 different locations, they did air monitoring. While they were moving the dirt around, during earth-moving activities, they did air monitoring, and they looked at the history of testing for the materials, and then they looked for that material in the air while that construction was going on, and all of the results showed non-detect for any of the contaminants that were known by testing that they did. And that was on the downwind side during construction activities. So that's the best information data that we have available. We can't answer for all, going back to 2013, but we can say, when people were moving this stuff around, was there stuff airborne that was of concern, that was the typical constituents found in the pile? And the air testing said, no, we're not finding any of that stuff while they're moving the dirt around, constructing this berm. And that's the best answer I can give you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming tonight and sitting through all this. We'll keep you updated again. Please check the webpage so you can see the updates as they come through. Thank you all very much.